Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Nicholas Novacki.
Welcome everybody, and thanks a lot for joining us again in another episode of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies Defence Dialogue podcast. It's wonderful to have you with us again, and I hope all of you, wherever you are, you're having a nice day. And my name is Dr. Nicholas Novacki, and with me here today, as usually, is my good friend and colleague, Alvaro de la Cruz, our Communications and New Media Officer. Thanks a lot for joining, Alvaro.
Thank you for having me, as usual, Nicholas. It's my pleasure.
So, quite a lot has been happening in Europe and in the areas around Europe during the last couple of months. Since the Russian invasion or Russia's attack against Ukraine began on the 24th of February this year. And we are now in May, so that means that the current Russian aggression against Ukraine has been going on for about 2 months already, like just a little bit over 2 months. And in some ways, it's incredible that we are already in the second month, because I remember when the war began and shortly even before the war began, there were a lot of doomsayers here in Europe and also elsewhere saying that Ukraine would collapse in weeks, if not days, once the Russian aggression would begin. But Ukraine has really demonstrated incredible resilience. The Ukrainian population has demonstrated incredible fighting spirit and a willingness to defend their home country. And importantly as well, the Russian armed forces have also demonstrated an incredible lack of capacity to fight, or the fighting capacity has been much lower than was anticipated in February or in January, when Russia was still building up its forces along the Ukrainian border. And the war has, of course, caused a dramatic change of attitude towards Russia in Europe. The war has caused Europe to do almost everything it can to support Ukraine in its war effort and to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty against the Russian aggression. We've seen a lot of European countries providing air defense missiles and all sorts of different types of lethal fighting equipment, and also non-lethal equipment to Ukraine to increase Ukraine's ability to defend its sovereignty. And the European Union as an institution has also stepped up. I mean, the EU has increased its sanctions on Russia in coordination with the United States and other close partners, and really quite spectacularly also agreed to provide Ukraine a €1 billion assistance package through the European Peace Facility, so that Ukraine would be able to acquire lethal capabilities and other equipment that it needs to defend itself. And in addition to all these different reactions that we've seen from European countries and the European Union, one really interesting development that the war or Russia's attack on Ukraine on the 24th and then the ensuing conflict has caused is the security and defense political debate in the Nordic countries, particularly in Finland and in Sweden. For a long time, for almost ever since the end of the Cold War, Finland and Sweden, have been enhancing their cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with NATO, and with the United States. But they have not joined the alliance yet. They did not apply to join NATO along with other European countries when there were a couple of waves of NATO enlargements in the late 1990s and early 2000s, because although they joined the European Union, there was what one might describe as a cultural affinity to this idea of non-alignment. The Cold War era neutrality has vanished from both countries, especially once they joined the European Union in 1995. So neither Finland nor Sweden is technically neutral anymore and does not describe oneself as neutral in their defense and security policy white papers. The term that they have used over the past years is militarily non-aligned, but not neutral, and this is of course important. But now it looks like Finland and Sweden are taking steps towards joining NATO. Very sudden, very serious steps, and if you look at Finland, for example, Finland seems to be on the verge of announcing that it will apply to join NATO at the sometime around the middle of this month. We are currently recording this episode in the beginning of May. So around the middle of May, there might already be a Finnish announcement that Finland will apply to join NATO ahead of the summit that NATO will have in Madrid at the end of June. And this is really quite a spectacular development because there has never really been a serious debate about joining NATO in Finland. There have been some people are calling and some political parties calling for Finland to eventually join, but for the most part, the political establishment has been very careful about expressing any sorts of thoughts or support, for open support at least, for applying for NATO membership. And this has to do with the cultural affinity to this idea of non-alignment, and also because of the very practical necessity of trying to maintain at least some kind of workable political relations with Russia, with which Finland shares a land border of 1,340 kilometers. But the aggression against Ukraine that Russia has taken has changed mentalities in both Finland and Sweden. The change did not really come from the political establishment itself. Interestingly, it came from the broader population. There was quite a dramatic change in public opinion when it comes to joining NATO. Before the war, the current aggression against Ukraine began on the 24th of February. I believe most opinion polls that came from Finland on NATO membership were expressed support for NATO membership around a bit less than 30%, I believe. They used to be in about between 25 and 30%. That is the support for NATO membership in Finland. But since the war began, support has increased quite dramatically. It is now about between 65 and 68%. So really, really a dramatic shift in public opinion. And it was really after the war began that for the first time ever in Finland history, there was the public opinion for NATO membership increased above 50%. So really a historic change. And it is this change in public opinion that then pushed the political establishment to take moves when it comes to the NATO membership debate. The Finnish government and the president of the republic have held already quite extensive preliminary consultations with their closest partners here in Europe, but also with the United States. A revised security and defense policy white paper has been presented to the Finnish parliament, which does not explicitly recommend NATO membership, but it makes clear that given the changed security environment around Finland, that Russia's war against Ukraine has caused, there really isn't any other viable option than applying for NATO membership. And this is a historical development, and it also is something that if Finland does announce this month in May, or at any other point this year that it will apply NATO and then eventually will submit its application to join NATO, it will have, of course, implications not only for NATO, but also for the European Union. And especially during the period that begins when the application is submitted until the application is accepted and Finland becomes a NATO member. And the reason for this is that Finland is still not a NATO member state. It will not be a NATO member state during the application process. And this means that neither Finland nor Sweden will be covered by NATO's Article 5, the alliance's mutual aid and mutual defense clause during the application process. And if you have a look at the revised security and defense white paper that the Finnish government presented to the parliament earlier, it makes clear that there are quite a bit of risks and threats. And Finland is expecting Russia to react to the NATO membership application. And the country needs to be prepared for eventualities such as increased cyber attacks, some kind of hybrid influence within Finland, the possibility of large amounts of irregular migrants starting to come across the border with Russia, which is something that did already happen earlier, like some years ago, when suddenly large amounts of migrants from the Middle East started to come across the Finnish the border between Finland and Russia, especially in Lapland. So these are the types of eventualities that need to be prepared. And of course, disinformation and all sorts of other influence activities. So this means that if the tensions increase and if there is any kind of Russian attempts to influence or destabilize Finland during its NATO membership application process, the EU will, of course, have to step up and then do what it can to defend Finland. And I don't think that it would be out of the question to imagine that if something would happen, that Finland would consider activating Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union, the EU's own mutual aid and assistance clause, or Article 222 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the Solidarity Clause. And the EU, fortunately, has quite a lot of tools and instruments in the area when it comes to tackling irregular flows of migrants and refugees, tackling hybrid threats, tackling disinformation, etc. So the readiness in the European Union and in other EU capitals needs to be increased as well to make sure that both Finland and Sweden will feel as secure as they possibly can during the NATO application process. I think that if Finland and Sweden eventually join NATO, this will, of course, some affect or probably affect in some ways the EU's own security and defense policy, of the development of which both countries support quite strongly. I don't think the effects will be really strong or very significant, because we have to remember that a large amount of most EU countries are already NATO member states. Both NATO EU countries and non-NATO EU countries have committed to developing and implementing the EU security and defense policy in the Treaty on European Union. And both NATO and the EU have increased their bilateral security and defense cooperation, especially since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and relations between the two organizations are pretty good at the moment, even though there are occasional differences and tensions. But these differences and tensions are quite a bit less than what they used to be. But I think the most significant change will probably be for Finland's approach to EU security and defense cooperation itself. There's a couple of reasons for this. I think the first reason will be that during the early years of its NATO membership, I think there will probably be an effort in Helsinki to make sure that Finland will try to get into the core of NATO. It probably wants to be kind of a model NATO member state in the beginning of its NATO membership, to show to other NATO countries that Finland is a responsible, active NATO member state, and they made the right decision to admit Finland into the country. And this sort of phenomenon happened a little bit also in the 1990s and early 2000s when Finland joined the European Union. There was a conscious effort to go into the core of the European Union and support European integration, to join the Eurozone, etc., and to be an active member of the Union. I think this is something that we'll probably see in NATO as well. Another thing is that I think one thing that Finland has spoken quite a lot in the past years is the necessity of developing Article 42.7, the EU's own mutual assistance clause, in the past years. And this is something that most EU member states have been quite quiet. They haven't really understood completely the the value and the relevance of Article 42.7 for their national security and defense policies, simply because they are already members of NATO and they're covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is considered a lot more credible and functional than Article 42.7. I think Finland will probably double down on advocating the necessity of safeguarding the primacy of NATO in Europe, ensuring that NATO's Article 5 will be credible and that NATO countries do what they can to meet the 2% of GDP defense spending target when it joins. And then it will have less necessity and there will be less reasons to call for strong operational Article 42.7 in the EU context when Finland will then get the type of security guarantees that it has always been looking for from NATO. It's possible that the EU mutual aid and assistance clause will not lose its significance completely to Finland, because let's not forget that both NATO and the EU have competencies in different areas. And there have been arguments and there have been studies and discussions among the member states in which most member states have expressed that the EU's own mutual aid and assistance clause should be used primarily in situations that fall underneath the threshold of activating NATO's Article 5. So in cyber and hybrid situations, perhaps the EU article will continue to have some relevance for Finland. But I think overall, we'll probably see that as a NATO EU country, Finland will probably become a little bit more Central European, perhaps a little bit more like Germany, in a sense that it will advocate for a strong and credible NATO. It will advocate for NATO's primacy when it comes to European security and defense, but it also supports an effective and credible EU security and defense dimension, because both NATO and the EU, as I already mentioned, they deal with a little bit of different sort of things. And especially in the past years, the EU has been specializing in joint capability development, tackling non-traditional threats such as like cyber attacks and hybrid threats, and it has quite a large toolbox in this area. So interesting times, and we'll see what happens.
Interesting is the very least we can say, indeed. Niklas, to start with Finland, which is not only closest to you, but also probably a much more strategic country for us than Sweden right now because of the long border shared with Russia that you mentioned. Finland is right now the only EU member state with a border in Russia that is not a NATO member. What took you so long? I mean, Sweden's culture for neutrality, it's one thing. Also, they are close to Russia, but they don't share a border with Russia. And you are the EU member state with the longest border with Russia, and despite so, the only one not belonging to NATO. Why did we have to wait for the invasion in Ukraine for this to happen? Were there not enough reasons until now for joining the alliance?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, the first reason is it relates to strategic culture, because at the end of the Cold War, the culture of Finland's neutrality and non-alignment was not fundamentally disproven as a wrong foreign policy choice during the Cold War, and it was something that Finland followed out of practical necessity because it maintained its independence at the end of the Second World War, but it had very limited space for maneuver, being next to the Soviet Union and having signed in 1948, I believe, the Friendship Cooperation and Assistance Agreement with the Soviet Union, which quite dramatically, effectively kept us in the Soviet orbit, without keeping us without having to be in the Warsaw Pact. So at the end of the Cold War, the policy of neutrality, non-alignment was not proven to be a wrong policy choice. The political establishment in Helsinki could go on saying that the neutrality and non-alignment policy was what secured our independence and kept us safe during the Cold War. And it's a smart choice to continue following the non-alignment policy, not the neutrality policy, but the non-alignment policy. I think second reason is that Finland probably hasn't considered that Russia would seriously consider doing anything dramatic in Northern Europe. I mean, the previous conflicts and crises in Europe's like geographical neighborhood that Russia has caused, have taken place in Georgia in 2008. And then the current Ukraine crisis dates back to 2014. And they weren't really all-out war. They were limited in scope to some extent. And they did not also kind of trigger perhaps the memories of Finland's own winter war against the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940, in the same way that this current war has invoked. I think what scared the Finnish population in particular was when they saw that Russia has the capability of deploying fairly quickly 100,000 troops by the border, not a friendly, but a non-aggressive country. It is an aggressive country. Russia is an aggressive country, and Putin is acting very erratically. So given this situation, and given that even though we're already a European Union member state, even though Finland has active and very deep defense cooperation with countries such as the United Kingdom, with the United States, with Germany, with France, there really isn't any alternative to NATO membership. And I think this is what really tilted the scales in favor of membership in Finland.
Okay, thank you. It is not always obvious for people like me from Spain, from the other corner of Europe, to understand this historical phenomenon. Everybody or many people know about Finland's capabilities. Not only you have a relatively robust army, you have a military service that makes that most of your, at least male citizens, have some military experience. You have one of the largest, if not the largest, artillery in Western Europe. So we know that you have tactical experience, you have quite recent experience fighting even Russia. But what are Sweden's capabilities? What is the added value for NATO beyond, of course, the final unification of the Nordics, at least under the NATO umbrella, and of course the strategic factor of having the entire Baltic Sea under NATO dominance? What are Sweden's capabilities? Because we don't know much about their military background and experience.
Well, Sweden has traditionally had like a very large armed forces, and I believe like during the Cold War, Sweden had one of the largest armed forces in Europe, unless I remember incorrectly. But since the Cold War ended, the size of the Swedish armed forces and their capabilities were decreased quite dramatically when Sweden tried to cash in the so-called peace dividend and cut defense spending and the size of the armed forces. But since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, during the time that Europe's tensions with Russia have been increasing, Sweden has been taking new steps to rebuild its armed forces, to increase defense spending, and to make sure that it has the capabilities and equipment that it needs to, first of all, defend its own sovereignty and take care of the threats and challenges that might emerge in its neighborhood. Sweden has also a highly developed defense industry. It produces excellent fighter aircraft, for example, that it uses itself and that it sells to countries around the world, and it already cooperates actively with NATO. Like Finland, Sweden is an enhanced opportunity partner with NATO and maintains already deep defense ties with the United States. But I think indeed, you mentioned the enhanced security in the Baltic Sea region, and I think it's not a reason that should be kind of overlooked. I think that's a vital, a very important selling point also, both Finland and Sweden's NATO membership. The Baltic Sea would then essentially become a NATO lake, and it would be much more difficult for the Russian Baltic Sea Fleet to cause any kind of mischief in the Baltic Sea region when if both Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and NATO would also then have access to geographically and strategically important locations such as the island of Gotland, in which the city of Visby is of Stockholm, a very strategic piece of land in the Baltic Sea. So I think Sweden is moving into the right direction when it comes to kind of rebuilding its armed forces. It has a highly developed defense industry. It's strategically important country in Northern Europe, and for sure the Baltic Sea security would increase if both Finland and Sweden joined.
Okay, thank you. Now moving to the accession process. Let's say both Sweden and Finland have their application ready before the Madrid summit this June. If everything goes okay, for how long do you think the process of accession should prorogate? I mean, for when could we see both Finland and Sweden like fully members of NATO?
I mean, there's what I think like should happen, and then what I think like will happen. I do hope that when the two countries submit, if and when the two countries submit their NATO membership applications, the ratification process will be as quick as possible. Now, I think a good starting point is the fact that the armed forces of both Finland and Sweden are already highly NATO compatible. They have equipment that is already like valuable for NATO. So integrating them into the alliance like should not be a problem. And that this is something that should be straightforward. If anything, Finland and Sweden are more NATO compatible like that than some existing NATO member state, paradoxically. But of course, admitting new members into NATO requires unanimity in the alliance. So, in other words, like each NATO country like needs to approve the accession of Finland and Sweden, and there will be parliamentary approval processes in some NATO allies, and parliamentary processes will of course inevitably take a little bit of time. And I believe in the past, I think the quickest NATO accession process has taken for about 1 year. So I think we can expect probably the longest around a year's process, provided that there won't be any difficult countries, difficult NATO allies like who would have any reason for kind of putting an obstacle in front of Finland and Sweden's desire to join the alliance. It's a possibility, but I do hope that we will not see this. And if everything goes well, I hope that we can have it done in less than a year. And it is important to get it done as quickly as possible to make sure that then once the application is submitted and the application process begins, that both Finland and Sweden will get under the protective umbrella of Article 5 as quickly as possible.
Right. Because that leads to my next and final question for you today, Niklas. We have, more or less around a year ahead of us of the accession process. Let's hope during this period of time, we'll have elections both in Sweden and Finland. The elections in Sweden are expected to be on September 11 this year, and in Finland next April. Right now, both countries are governed by socialist parties. And how do you think this process and this momentum could affect this election, both for the parties in the government or the opposition?
It's hard to say. When it comes to Finland, there is a tradition of taking these sorts of decisions by cross-party consensus and trying to achieve a pretty strong consensus across all parties, both parties in government and parties in opposition. And this is indeed something that we have seen. So it is difficult to see like what will happen between now and then the elections next year, because this is uncharted territory for everybody. And I think what is hoped and what parties both in government and in the opposition are hoping that once the NATO application process begins, once the NATO membership application is submitted, that Finland's NATO membership will not become a party political issue that would be kind of reopened for discussion and debate during the elections next year. And I have been kind of very happy in noticing kind of the level of agreement across this party spectrum that there has been in Finland when it comes to making this really historical and significant and consequential choice.
Okay, well, let's hope for those elections to be as clean as possible and beneficial for the EU and NATO's interest. And I am looking forward to be able to tell you welcome to the family, Niklas.
Yeah, Spain has been already a member for quite some time, so I mean, I look forward to getting any tips and ideas that you might have how to behave as possibly.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you, Niklas.
Thanks a lot, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Martin Center's Defense Dialogue podcast. And have a wonderful day wherever you are. And please join us again in the future. Ciao.
That was today's episode of Defense Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.